The day my son drove me to a nursing home, I actually thanked him. Looking back now, that's the part that hurts the most. I wasn't forced into the car. I wasn't tricked with fake medical papers. I climbed into the passenger seat because I trusted the little boy I had spent my entire life protecting. As we drove through the quiet streets of Columbus, Ohio, he kept smiling and telling me this was only temporary. "Dad," he said, "the contractors need the house completely empty while they renovate it. It'll only be 4 or 5 weeks. After that, you'll come home to a beautiful new place." I looked out the window and smiled. I told him he didn't have to spend so much money on me. He laughed and said, "You've spent your whole life taking care of me. It's my turn now." Those words stayed in my head for days. 3 days later, while sitting in the nursing home's common room watching the local evening news, I saw a real estate commercial. The camera slowly panned across a beautiful 2-story brick house with white shutters and a maple tree in the front yard. My house. My home for 43 years. A bright red sign stood in the front yard. "For sale." Then the reporter smiled into the camera and said, "This beautiful family home just entered the market this morning." My coffee slipped from my hand and shattered across the floor. My son wasn't renovating my house. He was selling it. My name is William Parker, and this is the story of how my own son believed he had outsmarted an old man, until he discovered the one thing I had never signed away. I was 72 years old when this happened. My wife, Margaret, and I built our home from nothing. We bought the land before we even had enough money to build on it. For almost 2 years we lived in a tiny rented apartment while every extra dollar went into construction. Every Saturday, I worked beside the builders to save labor costs. I painted walls myself, installed kitchen cabinets with my brother, planted the maple tree in the front yard the week our son, Daniel, was born. Every room inside that house carried a memory. The scratch on the hallway wall from Daniel's toy fire truck. The height marks we penciled onto the laundry room doorframe every birthday. Margaret's rose garden beneath the front window. To most people it was just another house. To me, it was the story of my life. Margaret passed away 6 years before everything happened. Cancer. The doctors fought hard, but eventually there were no treatments left. On her final evening, she squeezed my hand and whispered something I have never forgotten. "Promise me you'll never let loneliness make your decisions." At the time, I thought she meant dating again. Years later, I realized she meant something much deeper. Lonely people trust too easily. They mistake attention for love. They accept help without asking questions because they are afraid of losing the people who still visit. After Margaret died, Daniel became my entire world. He visited every Sunday with his wife, Melissa, and my 2 grandchildren. At least, he did at first. Then work became busier. Sunday visits turned into every other weekend. Then once a month. Then mostly phone calls. I never complained. He had a family, a career, responsibilities. I told myself that was simply how life worked. Daniel wasn't a bad child growing up. Quite the opposite. He was thoughtful, hardworking, and curious. I still remembered helping him build model airplanes on the dining room table. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle in front of our house. The first time he fell, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Don't let go, Dad." I promised I wouldn't. And I never did. Through broken bones, failed exams, first heartbreaks, college graduation, marriage, and fatherhood, I was always there. If he called at midnight because his car broke down, I drove across town. If he needed help with a mortgage payment after the recession, I wrote the check without hesitation. I believed that's what fathers were supposed to do. What Daniel never fully understood was how our family business actually worked. 35 years earlier, I founded Parker Industrial Solutions with 2 close friends. We manufactured specialized heating equipment for hospitals and commercial buildings. During the first decade, we nearly went bankrupt 3 different times. We survived because we refused to quit. Eventually, the company grew into one of the largest manufacturers in the region. 10 years before I retired, my partners sold their shares back to the company. I quietly became the majority shareholder. When Daniel joined the business after earning his MBA, Everyone assumed he would eventually take over. I wanted that too. But experience had taught me one important lesson. Ownership should never be confused with management. So I promoted Daniel to Chief Executive Officer. I remained majority owner. Most people didn't know the difference. Apparently, neither did Daniel. I attended board meetings less often after retirement. I let Daniel run daily operations because I wanted him to succeed on his own. Every quarterly report looked impressive. Revenue increased. New contracts arrived. Employees seemed happy. I was proud of him. Whenever friends complimented my son, I smiled and said the company was in good hands. About a year before the nursing home incident, Daniel started asking unusual questions. "Dad, have you updated your will? Do you still have the original house deed? Have you considered putting everything into a family trust?" The questions seemed reasonable. People my age think about estate planning. So I answered honestly. I told him my attorney handled everything. He looked disappointed. At the time, I assumed he simply wanted to help. Now I know he wanted information. Around the same time, Melissa became unusually interested in the house. She constantly talked about how difficult it was to maintain such a large property. She pointed out every loose gutter, every cracked sidewalk, every outdated appliance. One evening during dinner she casually said, "Dad, imagine how much easier life would be if you lived somewhere people could take care of you." I laughed. I've been taking care of this house for 40 years. It hasn't beaten me yet. She smiled politely. But Daniel didn't laugh. He simply looked down at his plate. A few months later, I slipped while cleaning leaves from the back porch. I bruised my hip badly, but nothing was broken. My doctor recommended using a cane for several weeks. Somehow, that tiny accident changed everything. Daniel suddenly insisted I shouldn't be living alone. Melissa agreed. The grandchildren started asking if Grandpa was okay. Neighbors told me Daniel had been asking whether they thought I seemed forgetful. Forgetful. I paid every bill on time. Still drove safely. Still volunteered twice a week. Still managed my own finances. Yet people suddenly looked at me differently. As though someone had quietly planted the idea that I couldn't care for myself anymore. Then came the family meeting. Daniel and Melissa sat across from me at the kitchen table. They looked serious. Daniel reached across and held my hand. "Dad, we're worried about you." I smiled. "I appreciate that." He continued. "We found a wonderful retirement community. Just for a few weeks while we renovate the house." Melissa handed me a glossy brochure filled with smiling seniors walking through flower gardens. It looked peaceful, safe, temporary. I asked one question. "Will I be back home before Thanksgiving?" Daniel smiled immediately. "Absolutely." I believed him. 3 days after moving into the nursing home, I saw my house on television. For sale. I couldn't breathe. I immediately called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. I called Melissa. No answer. I called my attorney. He answered on the second ring. Before I could say anything, he quietly asked, "William, where are you?" I looked around the nursing home's common room, then answered, "I'm exactly where my son wanted me to be." There was a long silence. Then my attorney said something that made my heart pound. "Don't sign anything. I think your son has been preparing this for months." And at that moment, I realized this wasn't about a house anymore. It was about everything I owned. After my attorney told me not to sign anything, I stopped thinking like a father. For the first time in 72 years, I started thinking like the businessman who had built Parker Industrial Solutions from an empty warehouse and a single welding machine. Something about Daniel's behavior suddenly made sense. The questions about my will. The pressure to leave my home. The rushed move to the nursing home. The temporary renovation. None of it was spontaneous. It was planned. My attorney, Richard Hayes, arrived at the nursing home less than an hour later. The moment he entered my room, he locked the door behind him. Then he placed a thick folder on the small table beside my bed. "William," You need to prepare yourself. I looked at him. What happened? He opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents I had never seen before. Power of attorney. Medical capacity forms. Real estate authorization. Every page carried my name. Every page carried my signature. Except, they weren't my signatures. I stared at them in disbelief. Someone had copied my handwriting. Not perfectly, but well enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely. Richard looked directly at me. I already sent these to a forensic handwriting expert. They're fake. I closed my eyes. My own son had forged my name. Richard continued. It gets worse. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had quietly called a special meeting of the company's board of directors. He told them my health was rapidly declining. He claimed I wanted to step away permanently. He even suggested appointing himself executive chairman. Without telling me. Without inviting me. Without my vote. I felt my chest tighten. Not from anger. From disappointment. I had trusted him with everything. The business. Our family name. My life's work. And he had mistaken trust for weakness. Richard leaned forward. Fortunately, he forgot one important detail. I looked at him. You still own 51% of the company. I smiled for the first time that week. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I still had a chance to protect what Margaret and I had built. Richard immediately scheduled an emergency board meeting for the following morning. Meanwhile, I quietly asked one favor. I don't want Daniel to know I'm coming. Richard smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The next morning, a black sedan picked me up from the nursing home. Not because I lived there. Because I was checking out. Permanently. As we drove toward company headquarters, I looked out the window at the factory. The same building where I had spent most of my adult life. I remembered hiring our first employee. Winning our first contract. Working 16-hour days beside welders and engineers. Every brick represented sacrifice. I wasn't going to let greed erase 40 years of honest work. Inside the boardroom, Daniel stood confidently at the front. He was presenting a slideshow. I quietly watched through the glass wall outside. With my father's declining health. It's time for a new generation of leadership. Several board members nodded politely. Others looked uncomfortable. Then, Richard opened the door. The room became silent. Daniel stopped speaking. He slowly turned around. The remote control slipped from his hand. Dad. Nobody moved. I calmly walked to the head of the conference table. The same chair I had occupied for 3 decades. I sat down. Then quietly said, I don't remember retiring. A few nervous laughs echoed around the room. Daniel looked pale. I thought. You were still. In the nursing home. I smiled. So did I. The board members exchanged confused looks. Richard stood beside me. Then calmly distributed copies of the forged documents. One by one. Everyone began reading. The atmosphere changed immediately. One director removed his glasses. Another shook his head. Finally, Richard spoke. The signatures are fraudulent. The medical documents are fraudulent. The property authorization is fraudulent. The attempted transfer of corporate authority is unauthorized. Daniel tried to interrupt. I can explain. I looked at him. No, you've explained enough. He swallowed hard. Then looked toward Melissa. She sat silently in the corner, avoiding everyone's eyes. I quietly asked my son one question. When did you decide I was worth more to you as paperwork than as a father? The room fell silent. Daniel couldn't answer. Finally, he whispered. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I nodded slowly. That's exactly what people say. When they get caught. Richard then introduced the handwriting expert. She displayed enlarged comparisons of my genuine signature beside the forged versions. The differences were obvious. Even the board members could see them. Then another surprise arrived. Our chief financial officer requested permission to speak. He stood up, then handed every director another report. Over the previous 18 months, Daniel had approved unusually large executive expenses, luxury travel, consulting contracts, private club memberships, most technically legal, none properly disclosed. Millions of dollars had quietly disappeared from company profits. I looked at Daniel. I trusted you with one company. You treated it like your personal bank account. He started crying. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to ask me to push him higher on the backyard swing. Then he quietly admitted everything. The failed investments, the personal debts, the pressure from banks, Melissa's expensive lifestyle, the house, everything. He believed selling my home would solve his financial problems. He thought if I stayed in the nursing home, no one would question it. He never imagined I'd still be paying attention. The board chairman finally stood. He looked around the room, then announced the decision. Daniel Parker was immediately removed as chief executive officer, pending a full forensic audit. His company access was suspended. His corporate credit cards were cancelled. His voting authority was revoked. Security quietly escorted him from the building. As he reached the door, he turned around. His eyes filled with tears. "Dad. I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment, then quietly answered, "I believe you're sorry. I just wish you'd been honest before you needed to be." He lowered his head, then walked away. That afternoon, Richard drove me back to my house. The real estate sign had already been removed. The front door opened exactly the way it had for 43 years. I stepped inside. The familiar smell of old wood and Margaret's rose soap still lingered. Everything was exactly where I left it. Except one thing. On the dining room table was a handwritten letter. It was from my granddaughter. She had only recently discovered what her parents had done. The first line read, "Grandpa, I hope one person's mistake doesn't make you forget how much the rest of us love you." I sat down in Margaret's favorite chair, read the letter twice, then smiled. Because in that moment, I realized something. My greatest achievement had never been building a successful company. It had never been owning a beautiful home. It had been raising a family. And although one branch of that family had lost its way, the tree was still alive. Sometimes, the hardest part of being a parent isn't sacrificing for your children. It's loving them enough to let them face the consequences of their own choices.